This is the ToothFairy demonstration for EtherScripter. EtherScripter is a smart contract builder for Ethereum. And in this demonstration, we're going to build a smart contract that imagines a ToothFairy on the Ethereum blockchain. So we'll call this the ToothFairy smart contract. And imagine what we want it to do is that a child can supply proof of tooth to the world when he's lost a tooth, and a ToothFairy can supply him some money for having lost a tooth via this contract. So to get started, we'll first want to initialize some values that we'll be using later, and we can do that with this initialize block, which allows us to do some things when the contract is created and then never again after that. But what we'll want to do is in the save slot that we're going to call the child, we're going to want to save some data, and the data in this case is his address, his Ethereum address, and that will be useful later. So let's go grab a real address. This is the Aleth0 Ethereum client version proof of concept 4. This is me, so I'm going to copy my actual address here and pretend I'm the child. And we'll do something similar for the ToothFairy because we'd like to remember their address for later too. Yeah. It'd be nice to have a real address for that, so let's grab a different one. This is Pat Jack, who had the original idea for a ToothFairy smart contract, so I'm going to pretend he's the ToothFairy. Great. So what do we want to do when this contract is contacted either by the child or the ToothFairy? Well, the first thing is to determine which of these two is in fact contacting the contract. So we can make a condition here that says when the contract caller is equal to the data that we know to be the child's address, then we'll want to do one thing. What do we want to do? Well, let's switch back quickly to this Ethereum client. When you interact with a contract, the way it works is you put the contract's address here, which we'll have after our contract is created, and you can send some amount of money to a contract. You can also send some data to a contract. So in the case of the child, he won't be sending money, but he will be sending data, and the data in question is some proof of tooth that he might have posted on the internet somewhere, and he can supply a URL to that data. You could even supply the image data itself here, but for our purposes, we'll pretend he's just sending in a URL. So how will we get to that data, and what do we want to do with it? I think we want to save it, and we'll save it in a slot that we'll designate as proof of tooth. And where do we access the data that the child would be sending in that case? It's actually available here. It's not in a save slot, but an input slot. That is the input to the contract. And there's a notion of numbered chunks of data when supplied to the contract, and the first numbered chunk is at number 0. So this is actually the URL that we saw the child pretend to input before. So great, the child has supplied some proof of tooth, perhaps. Now, what can the ToothFairy do when they contact this contract? First, we need to test to make sure that is in fact the ToothFairy contacting. So when the contract caller is equal to the data that we've saved as the ToothFairy's address, then we'll want to do something. Get that set up here. And what do we want to do? We actually want to forward on to the child the amount of money that the ToothFairy has sent, and in fact we can spend not just that amount but the entire balance of the contract that may exist, sending that to the child. And again, we have his address stored in the child slot. So that's okay, but we might want to consider what would happen if neither the child nor the ToothFairy are contacting the address. Somebody else just randomly sends some money to this contract, maybe by accident. It would be nice to send it back to them. So what we're going to use here is this if then else block. It's like a when block, except that it has a alternative condition when the, or rather has an alternative action when the condition is not true. And so we're going to make use of that here to allow the contract to send back any funds that come in from someone that's not the ToothFairy. I've just realized a bug with this logic, because if the child has sent in something, it will do this. Then it will test if the ToothFairy has in the contactor, and it will do this if that's the case. But actually the child would fall into this category too. That's okay. If the child sends money to the address, he should probably get it back, because that's not his role in this. All right, good. So what should happen? It should send the amount of this transaction back to whoever called it. Great. So we have a ToothFairy smart contract. So you might say to yourself, well, that's kind of silly. And you would be right. It's silly to have a ToothFairy smart contract on Ethereum. But we might imagine that this could be something more serious. So what if this is not just a ToothFairy, but the ToothFairy Insurance Company distributed? And this is not a child, but rather a customer. And this is not a ToothFairy, but rather a claim adjuster. So we have here the basic idea behind not just a ToothFairy contract, but a claims process for an insurance company. And so you can see here that this might be more practical in the real world, where a customer would want to supply some proof of goof that he's crashed his car or flooded his basement, and he can use this same mechanism to supply this proof to the world and to the insurance company so that the appropriate action can be taken by the claim adjuster. Now, the way we set up this contract, that appropriate action is determined just by the claim adjuster, but this could be expanded in a number of ways. For example, you could have several claim adjusters such that they vote on the proof of goof and distribute to the customer accordingly. You could include in here an arbitration clause so that a designated arbitrator would decide the outcome of the claim in the event that the customer and the insurance company register a dispute, for example. So there are many ways to expand on this, but the general idea here is the same for ToothFairy and for an insurance company claim process. So I hope that has been a useful demonstration and that you're inspired to create cool things with EtherScripter.